Everyone loves a good fun fact, but sometimes it is really, really interesting to look into unfun facts. And today I wanted to dive deeper into the fact that there is no longer a country on Earth that is debt-free. Now, a handful of countries and city-states have very, very low debt and were reported to be debt-free a few years ago, like Brunei, Hong Kong, and Kuwait. But don't get it twisted, government debt is a worldwide issue. Last year, the IMF forecast global public debt to near 100% of global gross GDP by 2030, from 93% at the end of 2024. Now, on the one hand, having debt and a free currency is generally a bad idea since you cannot control interest rates. But on the other, if you can actually afford to not have debt, then people will be begging to lend you at such favorable rates that it would be kind of foolish to not borrow a bit. So what kind of national debts are good? Which are not so good? Which countries have the best kind of debt? And when does overall national debt cross the line into becoming a very, very bad thing? Well, let's take a look.
The only way out of a debt crisis is to deal with your debts. That's why households are paying down the credit card and the store card bills.
Few beliefs are more widespread in politics than the belief that the government, like a household, should cut back on spending, balance the budget, and reduce debt. The household analogy feels right and responsible. But unfortunately, as we know from a very, very large library of literature, analyzing data across space and time, fiscal retrenchment rarely works. In the short term, it's associated with slower economic growth and rising inequality. In the longer run, this pro-cyclical approach is associated with increases rather than decreases in government debt levels. Even the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, long an advocate of fiscal austerity during economic crises, has found that fiscal consolidations in advanced economies does not, on average, reduce debt-to-GDP levels. So what is national debt exactly? Although we refer to it as a lump sum, the national debt of any nation is composed of different, distinct types of debt. Not that all different from you or I, whose debt may consist of a mortgage, a car loan, and credit cards, for example. Although I'm generalizing a bit here, you can kind of think of national debt as money borrowed by the government to pay for its expenses. So who does it owe this money to exactly? Well, the national debt in the United States, for example, is primarily held by the public, followed by foreign governments, banks, and investors. Which, yes, probably sounds a little bit funny if you just recently finished paying Uncle Sam your yearly tax bill. Like, how is it that I still have to pay the government taxes if the government is in debt to me? Yeah, weird, but let's talk about it. In a given fiscal year, when spending, that being money for things like roadways, healthcare, pensions, defense, and education, exceeds the revenue, money from federal income tax, for example, a budget deficit results. To pay for this deficit, the federal government borrows money by selling marketable securities such as bonds, bill notes, and inflation-protected securities. The national debt is the accumulation of this borrowing along with associated interest owed to investors who purchased these securities. As the federal government experiences reoccurring deficits, the national debt grows. Simply put, the national debt is similar to a person using a credit card for purchases and not paying off the full balance each month. The cost of these purchases exceeding the amount paid off represents the deficit, while the accumulated deficits over time represent a person's overall debt, which generally is problematic. In the United States, for an example again, we actually haven't had a balanced budget, meaning that in a single year, the amount of money coming in matched the money coming out since the Clinton administration. When we look at the totality of a government spending, some of it's predictable, right? We have pensions, education, healthcare, for example, and these kind of budget line items are anticipated. But sometimes a government has no choice but to blow its budget.
Things will get better, and we're going to get there together.
An economic recession or depression can occur, and they might need to bail businesses out. We can experience a global pandemic, for example, and need to send out stimulus checks, or more commonly, one country can declare war on another country.
We will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God.
During World War II, for example, the US raised money and went into massive amounts of debt by selling bonds. They still do this today, but most Treasury securities that fund debt aren't sold by those celebrities anymore.
Now, we got to pay for it. And I'm sure that every good American will be glad to help foot the bill.
They're sold to investors of all kinds: private, foreign, banks, companies, and even pension funds. And this kind of national debt is generally seen as a good thing because it allows households to save in a low-risk asset. Now, depending on which country you're in, they sometimes differ in name and regulatory environment, but generally speaking, these kinds of bonds are viewed as secure and a stable investment option, offering a predictable income stream and serving as a hedge against market volatility, which can be particularly appealing to conservative investors and those with long-term financial goals. Bonds and how governments manage them also can influence the amount of money available for lending by banks, helping to stabilize the financial system. And speaking of long-term financial goals, even countries who have a lot of cash on hand still prefer to take on debt rather than spend their savings. Take Norway, for example. According to the IMF, as of October 2020, the Kingdom of Norway's gross debt-to-GDP ratio was 40%, low by most European standards. However, Norway also has a very large sovereign wealth fund thanks to its oil wealth, which outweighs its public debt by a very large amount. Norway is one of those few countries in the world that actually doesn't technically need to borrow any money. But they do anyway because it's actually financially advantageous for short-term financial needs and market regulation. Plus, from a cash flow perspective, the government revenue from taxes and oil can be unpredictable, so borrowing provides a way to smooth out that cash flow and pay their bills on time. You see, Norway's debt is largely financed at lower interest rates than the returns it earns from its sovereign wealth fund. This means that while, yes, there's debt, the government is still making a net profit through its investments. But even if you don't have a pile of cash stashed away, debt can also be a good way for a country to be proactive in investing in themselves. By borrowing rather than raising taxes, governments can fund investments that benefit future generations, like infrastructure, military, or education, without immediately burdening current taxpayers. That particular argument, by the way, was the one used by the leaders of the CDU and the SPD here in Germany when debating whether or not to lift the debt brake. Here in Germany, roads, bridges, railroads have been worn out over the decades, and there really is an urgent need to modernize. Everything from energy to water infrastructure, the digitalization of telecommunications, schools, universities, hospitals, you name it. So for the Germans, borrowing money for much-needed investment would obviously have benefits in the short term, but it would also hopefully spur on more growth and investment, offsetting the long-term cost of repaying back that debt. However, I should mention there are serious arguments against this strategy, and it has divided both public opinion and political opinion here in Germany for sure. Which does beg the question, when does debt cross the line from being a necessary evil to just evil? Great question. If you happen to know the answer to it, you will solve one of the most hotly contested debates in macroeconomics. You see, unfortunately, few economists have a clear understanding of why too much debt is a bad thing, let alone how much debt is too much. And that makes it hard to know what to worry about and why. Because often we oversimplify and tend to assume that the extent of a country's debt burden is measured only by its national debt-to-GDP ratio. In short, how much debt does a country have versus the value of their output? Many often fail to distinguish between types of debt, who owns the debt, and the currency in which it's serviced. And that last point about the currency composition of that debt is actually really important. Let's think about an emerging market like Argentina, for example, or really any country who borrows in dollars. When their currency depreciates, then the dollar value of the debt becomes higher. So you need much more money to pay back that debt. Some countries, like Japan and the United States, issue debt in their own currencies and have flexibility in managing debt loads by printing more money. Although, yes, even these countries still face rising interest costs as debt levels increase. Also, if you want to try to find the crippling point of national debt, it actually really matters greatly on who holds the government's debt. Is it a bank? Is it investors from inside or outside the country? Was it short-term or long-term debt? To use Japan as an example once more, it actually has the highest debt burden amongst developed countries, at around 235% of GDP. Although it is certainly shocking, larger ratios like this one are somewhat more sustainable because the biggest share of Japanese government debt is held by domestic investors, which insulates the debt burden to some extent against global market financial movements. But at the end of the day, most Econ 101 textbooks are going to tell you the biggest danger of running up a gigantic national debt is how it can all too easily snowball and cost future generations dearly. And that's a very, very big concern for the United States. In pure dollar terms, at least, the US has never taken out so much debt so fast. In 2008, the gross public national debt was around $6 trillion. Then it was $7 trillion. Then 9. By 2012, it was at 11. Today, it's at somewhere north of $36 trillion. And look, at the end of the day, those IOUs are not free. We pay interest on it, and it's been rising. In fact, interest is part of the fastest growing part of the federal budget pie, making up around 13% of spending in 2024. That's more than we spent on defense. And the interest pie slice is more than twice of what it was just 3 years ago. Up until now, our massive ballooning debt has not stopped investors from buying it. Although we have had our credit rating dropped, the idea that the US would stop paying entirely and default seems pretty unlikely.
There is no other way to put this. Here in Greece, a financial calamity has just arrived.
On the other hand, defaults have happened in other countries throughout history. In Greece, a budget crisis forced the government to cut spending and raise taxes, contracting the economy. Unemployment reached 27% in 2013. It's a crisis that took years for the country to recover from. So, on the spectrum of national debts, where does your country stand? Like I mentioned in the previous chapter, the most common metric to analyze this question, particularly when you are just looking broadly across the globe, is to measure the debt-to-GDP ratio of a nation. This infographic on your screen ranks countries by their debt-to-GDP ratio, a key metric used to assess how much debt a government holds relative to its economic output. The data, by the way, comes from the IMF's World Economic Outlook, the April 2025 edition. As you can see, Sudan tops the list with public debt at 252% of GDP, driven by prolonged conflict and severe economic challenges. However, generally speaking, advanced economies are generally grappling with higher debt burdens than others, with an average debt-to-GDP ratio of 110%, compared to around 74% for emerging and developing economies. Along with Japan, Singapore at 175%, Bahrain at 141%, and Italy at 137% are among the most indebted developed nations. The United States also has a high debt-to-GDP ratio of 123%, reflecting years of deficit spending, lowering of the tax revenue, and large-scale stimulus policies in response to economic crisis. So, where does your country stack up on this global list of national debt? And how comfortable or uncomfortable does it make you feel about future investment and financial solvency? Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. And as always, if you enjoyed what you saw today, be sure to hit that thumbs up button. And for more content from Type Ashton, hit that subscribe button. So, I'll see you next Sunday. Tschüss!